Hello and welcome to the basic bone setup for the character animation class. And let's jump in. First of all, I'm going to simulate a lot of what sometimes happens in production. In this case, you receive a model and you look at it and go, well, this is not exactly clean. There are 3 of these versions. Go and talk to the artist and they will say, oh yeah, those are some poses. You don't need to worry about those. Okay, clear enough. So this is the one I'm looking for. This is the one I want. Yes, it is. All right. Well, then why is it all in different pieces? Well, it needs to be combined. Well, that's fine. We can combine this character. Little more talk. You find out that actually the character is going to be changing out weapons and changing out shield. So you actually want to separate those before you combine everything in the rest of this character, which you're going to do now. Combine. And as you notice in the outliner, it keeps residual history. And you also see here on the right, it keeps residual history as well. And that's stuff that you really want to delete, because if you simply come up here and press delete with this, it actually will nuke the mesh. So the only safe way to get rid of all that is go to delete all by type history, and it will delete the history and leave you with some clean meshes. And again, I am simply separating this out because in the simulation of this being a production environment, you sometimes will receive models that are not perfect, and you have to go through them and communicate with other people to find out, should there be things that I keep separated? And if so, what are they? And then what should I combine? So we've just learned that we're going to be combining this entire character. Then you talk about whether or not blend shapes are going to be okay for you to use in the game. And they say, sure, blend shapes are going to be fine. So at that point, you can separate out the mesh for the head. You can go over that in a different tutorial. But it's nice to stay sort of on top of what it is that's requested of you for rigging. And that comes by clear communication with the game designer as to what the character has to do in the game. So let's press 5 on the keyboard. And this is the numerical keys that float over the letters on your keyboard. Not the ones on your far right. Press 5 and you can go into kind of a hard shaded mode, which will help us draw the bones for this character. We also don't really need the sword and the shield, so grabbing both of those, you can turn off their visibility and it leaves you just with this kind of symmetrical character here. So let's dive in. Press the space bar, you go to the other 4 views, and you can press F, F, and F so that you can frame that character up pretty close. Second thing you want to do is kind of check the size. Well, what size character is this? And this is something you should check on before you even begin. So let's assume that I go to the game designers and they communicate that this character is 4 feet high. Well, that's fine. Let's go in now, and you can and make sure that we are dealing in Maya with our units set to 4 feet high. You can get there one of 2 ways: to go to the preferences by clicking on the person running away from this gear sun, and it'll bring up the preferences. The second way you can get there is actually going up to Windows, down to Settings and Preferences, and then go to Preferences. Gives you the same thing. We're going to scroll down to the middle of this leftmost column that says Settings. Click on that. Make sure you're in feet. Unless you're in the UK, you'll probably be in meters, metron. And then under degrees, 30 frames per second, foot, 30 frames per second. That's good. That's only half of the assignment, though. The other half of the assignment is that you've got to go in and make sure that your grid is set accordingly, because although this is now set in feet, there's no guarantee that this grid actually reflects 1 foot being a unit here, a little gray unit, because the display for the grid lives up here under display. Go to the options for it, and you can see that the length and width is every 12 units, and we don't want that. We actually want length and width 10. And that means that you're going to have on these 4 different matrices of grid work, you're going to show only 10 units at a time. Apply that. And then grid lines every 5 units. No, grid lines every 1 unit. That means you're only going to see a square every foot. And the subdivisions, no subdivisions within. I want the squares to be pretty clear. So we hit apply, apply and close. Good. Now we are sure that this character is dealing in a world where the ruler is 1 foot per block. So I want to go back to my outline, make these items visible because I'll be scaling everything up at once. Grab everything, go into your scale control, and just eyeball it. By the way, you may not have the pivot point where it should be. Let's say that, for instance, if you go in and you get the model where the pivot point is kind of in the center of the character, something's kind of common, it is going to be easier on you if you scale up the character. See, everything's sort of scaling separately now that I've unparented it. It's going to help you to realign the pivot point of this character so that it's basically at the floor. This character came in exactly on top of the floor, but it's conceivable that you would receive a character like this. And they're sort of halfway through the grid. And we don't really care that much about the location of the weapons because we're not going to be rigging those up just yet. But we do care about the placement of the character because we want them to at least be rigged so that they look like they are on the floor. So I'm going to raise everything up. And the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to realign the pivot point for everything. Now I'm on a PC, so I'm going to press the Insert key. And when I press the Insert key, I am currently going to be controlling the pivot point of all 3 items. I'm also going to hold down the X key and snap it to the grid. And that lets me snap it to 0, 0, 0. You can get the same effect by holding down the D key, D for dog, when you align the character as well. They're not actually right on the floor. They're sort of floating over the floor. So if I want to be precise, I'm going to bring them down so that that boot heel just starts on the ground. In fact, the tiniest bit of interpenetration is not bad. And then go back to Insert and press the X key. You can actually see the cursor change when I hold down the X key. In fact, there's a corresponding icon that lights up here at the top when that happens. It's this one, a little hashtag magnet. Hashtag magnets. How do they work? So you move them up and snap it to 0, 0, 0. And now we have a character that looks like they're ready to go, but wait. We've done all these changes, but we have not done a last freeze. You see, even though we've scaled the character, or we've moved them up, and now we're ready to scale them, we need to be careful about these numbers not staying there when we start rigging. So the first part of our exercise of trying to get everything scaled up appropriately, is translated appropriately is good. Now let's switch to scaling, and you just want to kind of get the character to look like they are hitting that 4-foot mark, or whatever the size is that is determined by the game designer. And there should be that level of clarity. You shouldn't be rigging things where people are just kind of sketching and going, I guess they're 4, they're 2 feet. They really should know at the point where they need to rig this detailed what's going on with their world. So we have translated and scaled the character up to the right size. These things are kind of cutting into his body. No worries. We will deal with those a little later. So I'm going to move them out to the sides and manipulate the visibility, or just press Control H, which is the hotkey for hiding things that you've selected. And last, I'm going to rename this, which is Goblin _ mesh. And I always call the characters what they are afterwards. So _ mesh makes sense because you're going to have _ shader, you're going to have _ layer. And if you simply name things Goblin or Scimitar or Shield, then you could conceivably duplicate just that as the shader name, and then the layer name and the animation name, and eventually you kind of invite something in Maya to get confused. So there is a lot of clarity now. Even with things hidden, I'm able to rename them by double clicking on the name here in the outliner, or I can select it and then double click up here. Either way, I'm allowed to rename this to what I want. And the last bit of business we need to do is to come up here and make sure that we freeze the transformations. Freezing them takes these numbers that are over here, 1.802 for scaling, etc., and actually freeze them to make this the new default size. So please take a look over here as I press the apply button under freeze transformations. Once I've taken a look that the scale, the rotate, and the translate are all lined up nicely, and then boom, the minute I hit apply, everything goes to 0 for translate and rotate, and goes to 1 for scale. The same thing happens with shield and sword. These are now the default sizes because I scaled them up appropriately, and I also translated them above the ground, and then I froze it. And the very last thing we want to do is come in here again and delete the history so that there is no record of any scaling, deleting their translations, etc. So make this as clean of a mesh as possible. In fact, now you want to come in here and save scene as, and just type in, let's say instead of Goblin Warrior, I'm going to call it Goblin Mesh. Mesh, simple mesh, or plain mesh. And yes, I've done this exercise before, so I have a whole folder full of these things. So let's start in on placing the bones for this character. The first thing you want to take stock of is kind of the character's makeup. He's got this sort of big bulbous head, a short little neck, and he's got long arms, which are going to help us for rigging, very expressive hands, and also kind of a short, wee little set of legs under a wee little kilt. And he's got huge boots, and everything has some very nice edge flow. So keep this stuff in mind because you may be rigging a different proportional character. Just take a look at the space that you have. We don't have a lot of space here between the boot flange and the hem of this kilt here, or tunic, and we have to be aware of that. Secondly, this is actually going to be a problem up here with this sort of Mad Max shoulder pad. He can turn his head very little before it starts smacking him in the jaw. So we're going to have to rig this so that this may be mobile or removable. Anyway, these are more things you want to communicate with the designer before you begin, but let's begin. So now in each of the views, I'm going to press F again, and it's going to realign the camera to our newly scaled character, allowing us to jump in and start placing bones. So the first thing I want to do is place the bones for the arm. The best way to do this is to click over here to rigging, and you can also pop between the different modes of Maya if you look in the upper left hand corner by pressing the different F2 and F3 buttons. You actually pop between the different modes in Maya. So on my machine it's F3 for polygons, and we are now ready to set up some bones. When you draw a bone, by the way, when you go to skeleton, create joints, which is what we want, you will create a bone system that will rotate best in the plane in which you draw it. So let me kind of try and communicate that as best I can. These are all basically hinge joints, unless you say otherwise. So the way that this rotates best right now is in the direction of it kind of up and down in the plane you've drawn it. Since I've gone to the orthographic side view here, this is going to operate best and rotate in that plane, meaning that from the front view, it's going to adhere to that side view camera best. Now, can I rotate this any other place? Of course I can, but the plane in which you draw these bones sort of dictates the optimal way they will rotate. So we have a desire to draw this arm and these legs and the spine in the side view. We have an interest in drawing the clavicle and possibly the hips in the front view. So let's move to the side view. One of the tricks we can do is go into hardware shaded mode and then pop up to shading. And if we want to see the bones that we draw, because sometimes they are swallowed by the mesh, if I say create joints, 1, 2, 3, can't see a bloody thing because it's on the inside of the character and the mesh is actually hiding it. Okay, so the way you can see the bones as you are drawing them is come up to shading, come down to X-ray joints, not X-ray, but X-ray joints. And it means that on top of the mesh, Maya is going to constantly draw the bones. Secondly, if you want these bones to look a little bigger than what you have, you can always go into each individual bone's radius and change it. Look what happens when I press from 2 to 5. It swells the big one, but since these are all connected, you go down to the outliner and next level down, you can change the radius for that as well. If I type 7, which is bigger, you get a bigger circle, last joint. I can make this very tiny one, and it's sort of a pinpoint. So these bone sizes can be ones that you dictate individually, or you could do them all at once by going here to display go down to animation and go to joint size. And then you have a slider with which to kind of slide them all up universally. Note they stick to the assignments that you've given them in a relative manner, meaning that if I've made this one 7, bigger than 5, it's going to permanently remain bigger unless I go in and kind of knock them all down to the same size. So after you're done drawing a bone, you can just immediately go in and grab that slider, and then you've got control over just how big all of the bones look at once, like so. There we are. So let's do this. Let's draw the arms. They're not going to be perfect because we are drawing from the side, and this character's arms are at kind of an akimbo pose, and we will modify that as we go on, so no worries there. Create joints. I'm going to go to about where his shoulder is, and then I'm going to go to about where his wrist is. And you're saying, well, I'm avoiding the elbow. That is true, but I don't really care right now because I'm just going to go from the top of the joint, his shoulder, down to the bottom joint, the wrist of the arm, and then I can go to the front, the orthographic front view, and then move these separate bone parts so they line up where I actually need them according to the front. So you can see that it just does not match in any way. Well, it does match the side view. Let's go to other views such as front and top and make sure it matches there as well. So I'm going to come in a little closer on this guy. In fact, I'm going to even take the radius size down because this is actually a bit too big for me. I want the joint size to be smaller so that I have a better level of precision as to where I'm actually placing this. So I'm going to move this only in the X. That's all I want to do, because if I just grab it and start moving it around anywhere, well, I've kind of messed up the precision with which I drew it from the side. So in this case, I'm going to press F when I have something selected and just move it over to about where I think a bone would exist within this arm. And I'm actually going to move it down a bit because I wasn't able to see through this this sort of shoulder piece. And now that I can better from the front, I can see that this sits much better in the middle of that mesh. And when you rig up a character, especially a cartoony one, especially a low poly one for games, you want to put the bone kind of in the center of the mass. You don't really want to replicate things with realism, like our spinal cord exists really along the back of our bodies. We want to put these in the middle of the body because they just we don't have a need to emulate the realism of the human body. Secondly, when we move bones, we can move their pivot point as we did a minute ago with the mesh, holding either the D key down or insert, depending on if you're on a Mac or a PC. But in this case, you can actually take the lower bone, since it's the end point, and just drag it over so that it sits more or less in the middle of the wrist. And I'm going to do a slight bit of movement here. That's more the wrist, when this kind of like little bump in the hand goes in. Plus, it's a nice place to avoid having to twist inside this little heavy metal bracelet here. I want to keep it just on the skin itself. So now that we've got that set up, and that's looking pretty good, you want to come up here to skeleton, and you want to put in insert joints, because what's going to happen at this point is you're going to be able to put a joint in the middle of the arm where the elbow should be. Boom, right about there. And verify where it is from the front. In fact, I can bring up the outliner to show you that they've actually inserted joint 3 between joint 1 and 2. That's okay, we're going to be renaming them. But when you insert a joint, it stays along the line that you have already previously set up with the first 2 bones. So I knew it was going to slide up and down and be exactly on this line of connectivity between the 2 joints, which was crucial for to make sure that I get the right rotation. So in the front it looks pretty good, the side it looks pretty good, also from the top. Now we're checking things out in 3 different dimensions. And this actually does not work. There's the slightest of bends in the elbow. You see that? There's a little crook there, and we need to emulate that. So from the side, we can come in, and if we move this, which we don't want to do, it's going to move the wrist placement as well. At this point, you want to go in and press or go into the mode for just moving the pivot point, and it moves just the joint. It does not move the child joint, and it does not move the parent joint. It moves exactly just the pivot point of that joint, which means just that bone itself. So now we have something that sort of more or less follows the flow for the arm, and I want to come in and start renaming these. First one is L for left _ shoulder. Then I come down to L, elbow, and I'm then going to go to L, wrist. Now, these are all obviously joints, and if I want to go in and name it joint, then that's fine, but it's a little bit tedious. So we have a chance to do it automatically here in Maya with this modify menu, prefix hierarchy names, and you can come in and actually give it something so that you can give the word joint to everything, _, and then boom, joint left shoulder, joint left elbow, joint left wrist. So that's a really cool little tool. You can take a look at it, and very simple, very easy to use. And if you've messed something up for whatever reason, there's a search and replace names. Be very careful, because in case you've renamed joint to blah, 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 I'm going to need that in a minute, then which is a pretty obvious mistake, I hope. You have the selection for hierarchy, you have it for selected, just change it on the selected, or change it for everything. So if I apply, I've got a mess. And if I then go in and say, no, I was just kidding, I don't know what I was thinking, just go back to joint, please. We're good. All right, so let's move next to the legs. Legs are very similar. But before we do that, I'd like to take every set of bones that we make and make a separate layer for them, because it makes things a little easier. I also like to, instead of creating layers and adding things to them, just select what you need to. Validate this in the outliner that I have all I need. Then go to layers, create layer from selected. It automatically creates a layer and then puts what you've selected into it. And when I double click the name, I then get an option box for it. And in this case, I'd like to color these things pretty obvious colors so they really stick out. So in this case, I'm going to make these a really, well, that's sort of the selected Maya wireframe color. So I'm going to make this one magenta. So save and click off, and now I'm validated by saying that is in the layer because it has the same color. And I'm going to be calling this arms layer. Remember, I like to put the name of whatever the medium is afterwards. We did this with the word mesh. We did it with the word joint. Now I'm doing this with the word layer, just so I can stay very clear about what it is I'm putting together. So we've got this part. That looks pretty good. The last thing I want to put in for this is I want to put a clavicle in. And this means that we're going to be creating this from the front, because the clavicle is more or less a joint that lets you shrug, and the shoulder is really kind of how you move your elbow around. So if you shrug, that motion is actually a different bone system than you moving your arm up, which is what people assume the shoulder does for both. So we want to make just a create joint where the clavicle would be, kind of where your own clavicle rests. If you take your thumb and click on your collarbone right below your neck, that's the beginning of your collarbone, and in the back you've got a clavicle there as well. So I'm going to pretty much approximate where that lives in this goblin, right there, tiny little dot, really tiny dot. Let's make it a little better than 0.53. There we are. So we can see him a little better, and add it, of course, to this layer. And it prefers to do that once I'm unselected. Add that object. It's now colored appropriately. This is how you can parent things without having to go in and always select two things and then go up to parent. You actually can use this capital P as a hotkey. Be very careful with the outliner open which one you are parenting to the other. So in this case, I've got joint left clavicle. I suppose I could call it collarbone, but I'm not gonna. So I want to put shoulder underneath clavicle because it should be the parent. And the way I do that is I grab one, then shift click the other and press P. And you can see that, and by the way, that was actually lowercase p. I didn't have to hold down shift. But you can see that everything is as it should be: clavicle, shoulder, elbow, and everything is left, which is pretty groovy. Okay, so let's move to doing the legs. Okay, so the way we do that is we come into the side view. Oh look, I have 2 perspective cameras. How do we sort that out? These are predetermined layouts in Maya. Just click on it, sorts you right out. So we are going to be, oh look at that, we missed something, bad dog. We want to make sure that this clavicle is in the right place. Insert, move it on in. There we are. And things constantly get changed as you go through your rigging, double, triple check. It's all good. Don't worry about making a mistake, just make sure you can fix it. So one of the things that we want to do in this particular case is get those hands out of the way. We can't because they're very large, but I'm going to use a bit of a trick, which is to grab the camera from the side and bring up the camera attribute editor and bring the camera's clipping plane closer and closer so that it stops drawing things at a certain level. And in this case, I want to push the near clipping plane out so it starts drawing things further and further away from the camera eye. What I've done there is type in 100, and it's got this guy sliced right in half as far as the camera's rendering. If I pull back a bit, and I've got 90, 95, 97, 99. I start cutting things off. So if you think of, if you place both your fingers near your eye, one nearer the eye, one further away, that's essentially what the camera is rendering at things between your 2 fingers. And if you move your the finger closest to your eye further away, you are shortening the distance of what Maya is drawing. And that's exactly what I've done. Is I pushed the near clip plane closer to this goblin, and it began cutting or stopping it stopped drawing the fingers, then the hand, then the elbow, etc. Bet I could push it even further. 99.5. Boom. That's how I roll. Dangerously. So there we go. Coming up here to the clavicle, this gives us a much better look at what is the body. And if I press insert, I can now put this a little closer to the inside of this fellow's body. It's grabbing the rotation instead of the translation. Okay, so I'm going to press the plus key on my keyboard, which sort of makes larger the controls for everything, including the translation of the pivot point. So I'm able to grab it without grabbing the rotations by mistake. I'm going to grab that in. All good. Wonderful. Okay. So the next thing we want to do is, with this newfound freedom, really get an idea of where where the hip is and where his knee is and where the ankle is, etc. The hip is going to be kind of a nice guesstimation because you can kind of create where you think the hip is up here, and then the ankle, and the ankle is down here. Boom. And that's pretty much all we need, because the knee is going to be done the same way we did the elbow, which was we're going to be using the insert joint. But before we do that, go to the front view and sort it out from this view as well. Okay, currently he's got a tail. So you've got to drag the whole bone over to about where his hip would be, and then move down to the bottom. And then you can either press insert or just drag the whole thing over to kind of where the top of the foot would be, the meat of the heel. And checking this out also from the top, and the top view, can you use the same trick with the clipping plane? Absolutely. So if I grab the camera and then here's how I did it. I did it pretty fast. Select camera and then select camera attribute editor. I've got the near clipping plane, and I'm going to bring that up to about 99.5, and boom, I've got legs. I've got tiny little legs. So that's what I can use to sort of gauge how close I am, and I can start dragging the camera back if I want to see less of the character but still see kind of the legs. So the hip placement looks pretty good to me. That's pretty nice. We might get an issue with the hips being higher in a kilt or a dress or a tunic, because it means you've got more things to manipulate. Remember, this tunic here, we have to divide it between the left and the right every one of these tiny little control vertices that makes up the polygon mesh for this lower tunic has to be given agency on one bone here on the right hip or the left, and we need to be careful about that, because the further up we put the hip, the more we have to deal with. So I'm actually going to hedge my bets and bring the hip down a bit, about there. That's where a majority of rotation is going to happen. Because if you bring up the hip closer to that belt's going to look awfully odd, which should be a very static thing. And you've pushed the hip up so much near the belt that you now have to take some of these vertices and give them half to the left, half to the right, and suddenly this thing looks squishy. So I'm trying to intentionally, and using the insert key so that I don't drag the heel down, I'm going to make a guesstimation here of how much hip we need to see. That's pretty much it, right below the belt line maybe. There we are. All right. And from here, you can gauge if it's in the middle of the heel. That's pretty good. I suppose I can push it forward a bit. I'm trying to get, again, the center of this boot. So right about here. And now I can take this and go up to skeleton, insert joints, and it will insert that joint near about where I need it on the knee. Them's is tiny hips, folks. Okay. So I want to leave that hip joint where it is. I think it's going to be safe, because that big old bloody belt buckle is going to cause problems. So now we need to determine if the knee's in the right place and if it even has the right bend, because it does not look like it has the correct bend. Press insert, move it forward until it looks like it's got about the same bend as the leg has. It's about sort of this tiny crimping here. Also, the reason you want to put bends naturally in every knee or arm structure that you have is that once we make the IK determines which direction that this thing compacts. Either it's going to rotate in the back here or rotate in the front according to the tiniest existing rotation in the bone. So if these are perfectly straight, you're telling Maya to flip a coin to say if the leg bends back like it does here with the kneecap in the front and the heel in the back. And we all know that legs go back like this, but you tell Maya which direction you want it to bend by having an existing crimp in the rotation, having the slightest bend already. So that's another reason to always make sure you've got that in your leg setups. So one of the things we've forgotten also is we want to put a nice series of toe joints in. So under skeleton, create joints. We've got, let's put where the toes might begin. And this guy's got some big old toes. Make them right there to the end. And then we grab one, then the parent, and press P, and it should be parented appropriately. And you can validate this by grabbing the joint in question, going here to the outliner, clicking on the title to make sure that it's now refreshing this. Press F, and you can see the joint here at the bottom. And crawling up, we've validated everything's copacetic. Lovely. So here we've got hip, and we want to put in left hip, and then the next one down is left knee, one after that, left ankle, and then left toe. And the last one, honestly, is just sort of toe tip. It doesn't really go anywhere. It doesn't really affect anything because there's no bones after it, but it has to be a bone just to have a place that you can visually determine is the end of this bone. So I usually give the word tip when I'm talking about it at the very end. It doesn't affect anything. So left hip, left knee, left ankle, left toe tip. Grab the top. We're going to go to modify, and we can do prefix hierarchy names. And from here we type in joint underscore. Keep the underscore, otherwise it's going to smash the word joint right after L, and we do not want that. Because we're going to be doing some searching and replacing when we mirror this joint structure to the other side of the body. So you need to keep things nice and clean. Okay, let's go back. So we have to bring over a couple of things because look what happened. We drew the toe after we determined where legs were. Yikes, no worries. Again, you can rigging is constantly about kind of going between the things that you've put together and making sure that you know how to fix it. It's not bad that you make a mistake. What's bad is if you don't know how to fix it. So in this case, I'm just moving things over to where they should be. And in this case, I do want to grab the top parent because I want the toe to go with. The one thing we don't really have aligned is we've got the side view, front view, kind of. But I know that from the perspective view, this guy's feet are kind of turned outward. You know, it's the he's got a slight rotation where the feet are not aligned like along these lines below him. They're not parallel. They're not like he's doing cross-country skiing. So the thing we want to take a look at here is get rid of that hard shaded and go to wireframe. We can see that we actually need to rotate this whole bone set so that it more or less matches the foot's direction. Now we have things that are a little more parallel to these lines, and if you want to be really kind of, you know, careful about it, you can rotate everything just to make sure it's more or less in the middle of the meat, as we say. And if you want to rotate it in this direction, because it looks like it's favoring kind of the left part of the foot. I'm trying to get it exactly in. I don't want to get too silly about it, but I think that's just silly enough. And if we go back to what I recommended in the beginning, shading X-ray joints, you can see every joint structure over the hard shaded now. You have to enable this kind of per view, but since we're using this top view, turn it on here, shading X-ray joints. There we are. So this looks pretty good now. I might even want to get rid of that silly camera slicing at this point. Near clipping plane is usually set at 1, and then 10,000 or something is a good way to end it. Okay, this looks pretty good, and we've got it all named. Now we grab the top, and we create a layer from the selected, and this time we double click on it and name it now the legs layer. And these will be colored a delightful shade of hot blue. Yikes. Okay. There we go. Well, we certainly can see it from space. So we've got everything we need here. And let's go in and draw now the spine. And for this, I actually want these two things out of my face, man. I want to concentrate so much on just the spine that I don't have to look at any of these other things, which is why we put them into layers, because we have that luxury now. So when I go up here to skeleton, create joints, I'm going to start at kind of the hip, the butt, the beginning of it all, and find out kind of where the coccyx, I think is what it's called, the hip bone and the sort of the tailbone of it. I'm going to put it down here. I'm going to put one cut slightly above, and I'm going to get to about where his chest or his rib cage would begin, and then I'm going to go all the way up to where his neck would be. And then I'm going to do a neck bone, and I'm going to do a head bone all the way to the top of his skull. All right, so that looks about right. Again, I tried to sort of match the middle of this mesh. And the reason I made such a long bone here in the chest is because that is the one bit of realism I am trying to emulate, is the fact that the rib cage is not bendable. So you need to make sure that that your characters are not just sort of gooey all over, unless that's the plan. You've got that kind of rubber hose animated character. But he's got a lot of objects here, like this bandolero belt, that if we put a bunch of different joints in, it's going to get awfully squishy again. Plus we have some things on the polys where they meet here, this little starfish of polys, and if this bends, it might start showing this breaking and fracturing. So but most importantly, it's the one bit of realism we're trying to give this character, as cartoony as they are, that our rib cages, our chests, really don't do a lot of the curling of the body. Really, it's the stomach, i.e. six-pack, or where the muscles are. The chest stays pretty much static because it's got that shield of a rib cage. It's kind of a solid helmet underneath the skin, and we want to emulate that. So under X-ray joints, and we can see our spine joint. The other thing that I've done, I want to kind of make sure that this is more or less at the sort of the bottom of this character. You know those artist mannequins that used to be these cylindrical wooden stick figures that people would use for posing action poses or whatever. This is kind of where the joints would begin in them as well. So the hip is traditionally where these bone systems start. They don't start at the top of the head and go down. They actually, like every series of appendages, start at the hip. You have different branching off into the legs, then it comes up to about here, branching off the arms, comes up to here, and effectively branches off into the head, possibly jaw, eyes, ponytail, depends on the rig you want. So we've done all that. It looks pretty good. I'm a little leery of how accurate I am to getting the neck. So I'm going to grab that camera and do my little trick one last time, where I'm going to start slicing in a little more so I can get past the flange and right into the body. Okay, that looks pretty good. This is kind of the base of the skull. That's the one I'm doing there. It's arguable that I want to bring that up a bit. So I'm going to go into translation, press insert, there we are. So I have a little more room at the neck. So I've got a neck rotation here, and I'm going to also move that up a bit because it looks like his neck really starts there. And the top of the head, the tip of the head bone here, is a place that in certain game engines you can affix different models to, pop them on and off. So if this character wears a crown, a tiara, a top hat, wildly different games, but it gives you that ability to just pop things on here, and if it just floats in the middle of his skull, it doesn't really do anybody any good. So I've usually learned to put it at the top of the head. You could talk to the game designer, should it be over here in the ponytail, so you can put an automatic in-game physics system on the ponytail, whatever. So we've got this spine going rather nicely. So let's crawl to the top using the arrow keys, go over to layers, create layer from selected. Suddenly we have a new layer, and it's going to be, of course, the spine layer. And this is the one we're going to color that ever-loving red. Red's going to hurt my eyes. Let's go to yellow. Yellow's good. There we are. It is absolutely something you cannot mistake from a distance. And select camera, camera attribute editor, go back to 1 and 10,000. Okay, good stuff. So with this character selected, save everything. Have I been saving secretly on the sly? Yes, I have. I hit the pause surreptitiously and saved because I trust no one, and allowed me to clean up my folder. So we've got here everything we need, save for the renaming of the joints, which is going to be, let's call this hip, and there's no left or right at this point. And we've got, I'm going to just call this belly, and then chest, and then neck, head, and then head tip. Can you have several different bones go throughout the stomach? Absolutely. It depends on the complexity of your character. These four-armed creatures of John Carter, Warlord of Mars, or whatever. There's a lot of things you need to take into account. We are just addressing this goblin and his particular size and proportions. So do take stock of the character you are rigging. If you have a longer torso, if you have longer legs, longer thighs, you need to take that into consideration of how much control do you want and how much warp do you want. So with this all put together, I want to show some tricks. And the first trick I would like to do is we are going to mirror these joints. And the mirroring of the joints allows you to take everything on one side of the body and create its duplicate on the other side of the body. And what we do here is we determine the mirror, the plane of the mirror. So Y is up or yup. Z or Z, if you're Canadian, comes towards you. And X is basically lateral left to right. So the mirror we want is up in Y and toward you in Z. And that's the plane that the mirror should be created on. So it cuts them in half. So YZ is the plane we want. And we're going to, before we hit do it, go and search for. This is something that's going to help us. Notice how we were very careful about making sure that everything had an L in it, and I separated it with underscores. This allows us to put in underscore L underscore and replace it now with underscore R underscore for right. And when you mirror it, now you've got something on the other side of the body. It's exactly the same. And now we've got everything named automatically for us, where it simply replaced the L with R. And now we've got this wonderful set here on the right where we used Maya to do the work for us. Let's do this again with the clavicle. We really don't need to change any parameters, and boom, we are effectively done there. And that is going to help us put some basic bone placement in. We can do the same thing for the hands, but I wanted to initially sort of talk about how you can use that tool set. And not only does it mirror the joints, but it also puts them into their respective layer, which is pretty cool. So save your work again, and we will continue to bringing it all together, as well as constructing a basic hand setup. Okay, so one of the advantages, of course, of doing this is that with the mirroring and having Maya do the work for you is that when you make a mistake, in this case, we didn't put the hands on yet. That's okay. Grab the rightmost set of bones, press delete. How easy is it for us to recreate that later? Come up here and you can simply mirror joints. Boom. That's how easy it is. So don't worry about it. We're now going to modify, add onto this arm so that we have a hand. So let's go to the side as these finger joints should be drawn in this plane because they're really going to be hinges, save for the thumb, which we can modify in a minute. And at this point, we're going to click on the joint left wrist, come up to skeleton, create joints, pop down here to the first finger, second, third. How much detail do we want on this character? This is where you go talk to the level designer, the game designer, and kind of say, hey, what does this guy do? Does he, does he fight with a sword or does he do calligraphy? And the game designer says both. And you say, great. So I'm now trying to determine where those fingers are. This is best done when I turn the wireframe on shaded on. That shows me the actual divisions here in the finger. And these edge loops are usually where the knuckles reside. So again, middle of the meat. Go down, and because I'm going sequentially down these, I don't care that they're moving the child. I could have done that with just using the insert or whatever you're doing with the holding down the D key, but in this case I didn't really care. I wanted to just get to, well, this point I'm going to care because I want to put it near the end so things don't get too crazy. I don't want to start grabbing the skin of this area and pulling it if I don't need to. So all of these fingers work pretty much from one angle, but as you can see from the side view, they're not really working at all. And before we spread these out, we may want to rename these. Now they're already pretty. They're named 1, 2, 3, 4. That's fine. If you were to name top finger, and then the next one is middle finger, and these will be joints, end finger, double click, Control C to copy the name, double click to go into paste mode, and you can go finger tip. And that is pretty good because I'm able to not just put the word joint on it, but I can also first put the word pointer. And so I've got pointer top finger, pointer middle finger, pointer end finger, yada. But since I know I've got 4 more fingers, if I just come up first to edit and duplicate, I now have another one for the next set of fingers that I can move. And if I duplicate one more time, I've got one for that set. And if I duplicate yet again, I got one for the pinky. And if I so desire, one for the thumb. And I do so desire. So duplicate. And then thumb. So this is how I'm going to organize this. This one is I've already determined is going to be the thumb. So I come up to modify prefix hierarchy names. I'm going to type in joint _ thumb. And I'm going to press OK. And then boom. Joint thumb top finger 4, middle, end, etc. Finger 3 is now going to be known as If I go to prefix hierarchy names, this one is going to be joint underscore pinky. All right. And this I've always referred to as ring finger. And I'm intentionally doing something here that we're going to go and fix in a minute. Come up here to modify, prefix hierarchy names, joint, middle finger, middle, yeah, whatever. Top finger, this is the pointer. This is the j'accuse finger. And that's joint, pointer. There we are. All right, I forgot to put left on here. Here's how you fix everything in one huge, giant change. And I hear you saying, well, now wait a minute. Hold on a minute. Hold on. We don't want to use prefix because we already have the prefix. How do we get through this? Now we come up here to search and replace. And in this case, I'm going to not look for that absurdity. But wherever you've got the word joint, it's now going to be called joint underscore left underscore. And it's going to fix everything because it's going to, you grab all these and just replace. Boom. And it did just for the ones that I had selected. So it left these alone and those alone. So that's how you fix things like that using those two tools. So now's a good time to save your work. You didn't see me do that where I just hit save. I did save as and I did a version. I just right now edited it out. Yeah, that's the ticket. Okay, so let's come in and rotate these as we need them per finger. And this is going to be done best with Wireframe unshaded. And I don't want to be too spend too much time on this. So I'm going to just come in here and do a grand rotation in the axis that is best served by that camera. And these rotations are okay. A little bit of translate so I can try and fit each of these bones inside of where the knuckle geometry is. Some of these are smaller than others, so I don't mind that. I will accommodate accordingly, but I'm really trying not to move it around in too many axes because the best way to accommodate that rotation is not by moving all the bones, but rather respecting that curve and just rotating it in the direction I need, which is actually in this direction. And there, so it's got a curl in it, but I needed to accommodate that curl in the other axes as well. Because this was slightly from the top rotated, kind of like the legs were. You see, you're trying to accommodate those different rotation values. And some are more severe than the others. You can only suss that from different views. So in this case, trying to maintain the respect for the axes, not moving them all over the place, but only specifically moving them in one axis at a time. I can see things a little better in perspective at this point. I can see where the joints are in the middle of the meat of the finger, which is a much smaller bit of geometry. So I'm just trying to make double plus sure that everything is good. And it looks like some of the knuckles are popped out. Now here's where I don't want to move the rest of the geometry. Gonna kind of have to make a call at this one. So I'm going to use the insert and just move it ever so slightly towards the knuckle. Same with this one. There is geometry. If you look at your knuckles, not everything is perfectly aligned. There's actually kind of a roll. And that's why these two seem to be popped out a bit more in X than the pointer finger knuckle. And I accommodated that. So this one's going to be, of course, a bit of a trick because I have to rotate it and fit it into an axis that it was not drawn in. So that's going to be sort of interesting to do. Usually I do not like to use the perspective view, but in this case it just helps because this is such a complex bit of evolution that when you try to emulate it, you realize, wow, that's really complex. So, yeah, opposing thumbs. There we go. And moving it a little more into the flesh. I think I've exceeded it in my earlier try. Wonderful. Okay. And a good time now to save. You know, where I've been doing save as the whole time. I'm already up to rig 4. How about you? And all of these different fingers here, of course, if you grab the last bit of the wrist and press P, everything gets parented to it, and they go also into the layer. Boom. That's how fast we were able to do it. Now we can come up here to the top, and just like we had saved previously under skeleton, mirror joints, now we have 2 hands done. So we spent a little time trying to get them precise, but now it's helped us. And we're set to go ahead and kind of bring all this stuff together. So the clavicle actually needs to kind of come down to where the chest begins, because that chest is going to move as one piece, and it's definitely going to move the clavicles. So I'm going to grab the child and that which it is parented to. The child. Let's try it this way. This is simpler. The child, shift the parent. Make sure the parent is the last thing you select, so when you press P, it puts it under the parent. And child and parent. Child, parent. You have made your first skeleton for your first character. Huzzah. So let's save this one last time. I didn't do that. What I did was I merely copied it so I could then change to 6. That's what I did. Okay, and one of the things we have to check is that whenever you use mirror and whenever you draw things, whenever you use mirror joints or draw joints, you have this assumption that everything is kind of in the right rotation order, but it is not necessarily true. And there's a way to kind of reveal this, and that is to show the local rotation axis, which is different from this rotation controller we've been using. You're asking basically, Maya, can you show me the way that you have aligned your understanding of the rotation of this bone? Remember, the rotation, according to this, is kind of at the world. You see that that doesn't really change. It's sort of straight up and down. But we know we've rotated this joint from when we moved it from its original alignment. So you're going to ask Maya, how do you feel? What is your thinking about this particular joint? And we come down to display, transform display, and check on local rotation axis. And then it shows you. So that's kind of the rotation axis it sees for that particular joint, which is a little problematic, frankly. We actually want the Y to be up, and we want the X to be aligned along the length of the bone. And to do that, we're going to be using a little script. But first, we need to display it for every one of those joints. And the way we do this easily is go into the outliner. You can either hold shift and click on the top of the hip, grab the top, scroll down, and then hold shift, click the bottom. It selects everything at once. There's another way of doing this, which is you can come up to hip, and then under select, you can go grab the hierarchy, and it'll grab the entire hierarchy of what you have selected. And now you go to display, transform displays, local rotation axis, and suddenly this entire screen is littered with them. And you can see that Maya has a very different understanding of the way that these are rotating, even though they are mirrors of themselves. The Y is the knuckles here on the left hand, and yet over here it's kind of this weird amalgam of X and Y, and they're not even aligned in the same direction. So there's winter is coming. So we need to make sure that everything is sorted out before we start weighting this up, and certainly before we start rigging it up. And we also need to turn this one on, because remember that when we grabbed everything, we included that one, and then we inadvertently turned it off by turning it on with everything else. And even there, everything is really kind of messed up. So there is a script that actually does all of this for you, and it is called Comet Joint Orient. I will show you where to get it. You can get it from Blackboard. That's where you get it. I have already put it into my custom shelf here in the blink of an eye. And what it allows me to do is grab everything again. We've done this before. Hip, I prefer automated processes, so go to hip and then select hierarchy, grabs everything, and then I can come up here to my saved Comet Joint Orient Mel, or you can look it up online. It's several different places. This is here, and that's only because I looked for, or Comet Cartoons is where this guy's webpage is from, but just look up Comet Joint Orient and you'll find some place that just gives it away. CometJointOrient.mel. There you go. So we've got all that, and here we go. So this is how the interface should look. Comet Joint Orient. I like to show the axis when I'm sorting things out because it really shows you the effect the minute you hit orient joints. So for me, aim axis is X, up axis is Y, world up direction is Y. That's the way I like to have things, and I click on orient joints. Boom. Look how that sorted everything out. That was a thing of beauty. Go back and rewatch that part of the video several times. You know, that's just amazing. That just made my weekend. So you can grab certain parts of it and try it again, or do it by hand. This may not work up here because it's not connected to a joint, so it's really kind of in a tizzy about which way to go. But basically your joints are kind of sorted in the direction that they should be going now. You can see that for the most part, every single joint has Y coming out at kind of the circle of the pivot, and the X is aligned along the direction of the bone. Wonderful stuff. In fact, let's bring it up one more time. Go to the very top of this and just hide the axes, please. Oh, of course, it only did it for the one I had selected. Hide axis, please. Thank you very much. Eggs, bacon, sausage. So let's also save this. Only give it a nice descriptor, which is, I like to put down bone oriented. That's just a little kind of note as to what's being brought to the table with this character and what's different about this character. Okay, the next thing I want to do is consider the possibility, if you are not going to be animating all of these characters' channels, that you turn a majority of them off. You can do this in kind of one fell swoop. We know we're not going to be using scale, so come up again to Windows, Outliner, Hip, select Hierarchy, and now we're going to go into a window, and we're going to be going into something that is going to set the channels for everything, and that's going to be under Animation Editors, General Editors, Channel Control. So from here, you have everything selected. We do not need scaling, and move that. We're not going to be translating these bones. We're just rotating them. So move that out of the way, except over here, which is going to be the hip. That's the one part that's going to move. So the hip, go find that translate again and make it go from these, the center column, which is non-keyable and hidden, back to move it over here to rotation translate. And this rig does not scale because we don't need it to, because we determined we're going to build it exactly at the height we need it to. If you have determined differently, then turn on the scales. But right now, these bones just rotate. Could you clean it up further and get rid of the rotation values you don't need in the directions? Well, yes, you could. You could ostensibly get rid of all the rotation values on the knees and the elbows that you don't need. But honestly, at that point, I'm not too concerned about it, because if you have one or two extra channels that they can do something with and that looks nice, great, no worries. So at this point, save your rig. Now the last thing we're going to do is cut this guy's head off. I think the easiest thing for us to do is to create a duplicate of the Goblin mesh, hide it, and then I want to see if this works. I'm going to just try a little trick. I'm going to grab the faces at the very tip of his nose, this little square here, honk. And then I'm going to come up to the tip of his ears, shift, grab that, shift, grab the other tip here. He looks like a really drunken elf. Santa says you're fired. Okay. Oops, did I go a bit too far? I think I did. Okay. So when you hit greater than, it actually sort of spreads throughout the mesh. And I'm using that to try and crawl down his face, your face, and get as many of those polys as possible that I don't need, and nuke them. Yikes, nice eyeballs, sir. Good Lord, haunt me in my dreams. So the next thing you want to do is try and carefully choose the polygons you don't want. I'm trying to be very careful about just getting the ones along that neckline. And there we are. All right, lovely. Henry V. So that's the mesh without, that's just the body. So now I'm going to go down to Goblin Body Mesh. I'm going to put that into a layer. Come here, you. Create layer from selected. And this is body mesh. And what do I want the body mesh? Layer. Well, I'll tell you. Because, and I'm going to call that green. Because I want to be able to put this into the reference mode, like so. And then I'm going to bring back the visibility of the other one and cleave off his body. And I don't want to accidentally delete all the faces from this fine, fresh fellow. I want to do it to, I don't want to delete the head off of this young'un. So I'm going to go maybe one more ringlet. Dare I push the limits? I dare. La. No, that's too pushy. Or is it? Hold on. Did I do this correctly? We'll see. Can I grab any other polys inadvertently or vertently? You go away. And I crawl up you and I squish your head. And I grab this. And that. So I'm just kind of grabbing. I'm grabbing faces left and right, man. Delete, go away, and crawl up. And now, there we go. I think, did I do right by the loop in his head? I think I did. I think I got that one. Yay! Plus you guys got to hear my really active thought processes. Okay, so good. I'm going to make another layer out of this object and just call it Goblin Head. Head mesh layer. And you, sir, get a finer shade of green than the rest. Blah. Maybe not. And there we go. Okay, reference. Cool. Excellent. And you are no longer Goblin Body Mesh. You are Goblin Head Mesh. I shall name you Goblin Head Mesh. We grab these two things and we want to come up here and delete by type, not delete all by type. Well, delete all by type history is fine with me. And that, again, sort of nukes everything so that it now is sorted out. You don't have a lot of history. We certainly caused a lot. And we have the head separated because you went to the game designer and you said, does this character talk and do we get really close up on their face? And the game designer said, yes, of course. Then you went to the engineer and you said, can this game engine use blend shapes? And they said, she said, of course, you fool. And you then slunked away and looked at your mesh and realized you had to cut the head off to do blend shapes. So let's come in here. And the next stage is to say rig head separate. And it's still 6 because when I am done with all of this intermediary stuff, I'm going to get back to effectively rigging, and I'm just going to go back to the default numbers. So saved, sorted, and let's make these visible again and turn this back on. There we are. So we are ready to rock. And the next tutorial should be on waiting this goblin. And I know you can't wait. Cheers.